In the name of God. In this session, we will read about cognitive linguistics, which is one of the school of linguistics. In this handbook, which introduced the cognitive linguistics, we will read its first chapter, which gives us an introduction to cognitive linguistics. In this paragraph, which is give us the time and the important person and the principle of cognitive linguistics. This paragraph is important and we should know about this matter. Cognitive linguistics comes from the late 70s and early 80s in the work of George Lakoff, Rand Lankager, and Ling, and that focuses on language as an instrument for organizing, processing, and conveying information. Okay, you should know that it's originated in the late 70s and early 80s, and this person are the important person of this school. And given this perspective, the analysis of the conceptual and experiential basis of linguistic categories is of primary importance within cognitive linguistics. The formal structures of language are studied not as if they were autonomous, but as a reflection of general conceptual organization, categorization principles, processing mechanism, and experiential and environmental influences. This paragraph is important. You should know it for the final exam, and even you should summarize this. But in this paragraph, which gives us some information about cognitive linguistics and just raise some question about that, is not important. The theoretical position of cognitive linguistics. Because cognitive linguistics sees language as embedded in the overall cognitive capacity of men, topics of special interest for cognitive linguistics include the structural characteristics of natural language categorization, such as prototypicality, systematic polysemy, cognitive models, mental imagery, and metaphor. The functional principle of linguistic organization, like iconicity and naturalness, the conceptual interface between syntax and semantic, as explored by cognitive grammar and construction grammar, the experiential and pragmatic background of language in use, and the relationship between language and thought, including question about relativism and conceptual universal. This matter will be discussed, and they are concerned with cognitive linguistics. That the language as embedded in the overall cognitive capacity of man, and this matter which are interested of cognitive linguistics. Crucially, there is no single uniform doctrine according to which these research topics, all of which receive specific attention in the chapters of this handbook, are pursued by cognitive linguistics. In this sense, cognitive linguistics is a flexible framework rather than a single theory of language. Cognitive linguistics is a flexible framework rather than a single theory of language. In terms of category structure, one of the standard topics for analysis in cognitive linguistics, we might say that cognitive linguistics itself, when viewed as a category, has a family resemblance structure. It constitutes a cluster of many partially overlapping approaches rather than a single well-defined theory. Okay, it constitutes a cluster of many partially overlapping approaches rather than a single well-defined theory. The cognitive linguistic contains the overlapping of many approaches, not just one theory. You should know the important matter of this paragraph. Even so, the recognition that cognitive linguistic has not yet stabilized into a single uniform theory shouldn't prevent us from looking for fundamental common features and shared perspectives among the many forms of research that come together under the label of cognitive linguistic. An obvious question to start from relates to the cognitive aspect of cognitive linguistic. In what sense exactly is cognitive linguistic a cognitive approach to the study of language? This paragraph is not important. It just raises a question about the nature of cognitive linguistic and ask about the approach of cognitive linguistic. Terminologically, a distinction imposes itself between cognitive linguistic and cognitive linguistic, which is uncapitalized. All approaches in cognitive natural language is studied as a mental phenomenon. Okay, when we use the cognitive linguistic in this form as uncapital form, it refers to the all approaches in which natural language is studied as a mental phenomenon. Cognitive linguistics is about one form of cognitive linguistic, which we write it as a capital form, is one form of cognitive linguistic to be distinguished from, for instance, generative grammar and many forms of linguistic research within the field of artificial intelligence. What then determines the specificity of cognitive linguistics within cognitive science? The question may be broken down into two more specific ones. What is the precise meaning of cognitive in cognitive linguistic, and how does this meaning differ from the way in which other forms of linguistics conceive of themselves as being a cognitive discipline? Against the background of the basic characteristic of cognitive paradigm in cognitive psychology, the philosophy of science and related discipline, the viewpoint adopted by cognitive linguistics can be defined more precisely. Cognitive linguistics is the study of language in its cognitive function, where cognitive refers to the crucial role of intermediate informational structures in our encounters with the world. Here, from this part, it explains about cognitive linguistic, which we write it with a capital sound. Dear student, these lines and this paragraph are not important. I don't want you to summarize them, but from here, from the definition of cognitive linguistics with the capital sound, they are important and you should summarize them. You should know the definition of cognitive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics with a capital sound, capital K and capital L, is the study of language in its cognitive function. The study of language in its cognitive function, where cognitive refers to the crucial role of intermediate informational structures in our encounters with the world. Cognitive refers to the crucial role of intermediate informational structures in our encounters with the world. Cognitive linguistics is cognitive in the same way that cognitive psychology is, by assuming that our interaction with the world is mediated through informational structures in the mind. It is more specific than cognitive psychology, however, by focusing on natural language as means for organizing processing and conveying that information. They look at the language as an instrument. Language then is seen as a repository of the world knowledge, a structured collection of meaningful categories that help us deal with new experiences and store information about old ones. From this overall characterization, three fundamental characteristics of cognitive linguistics can be derived. The primacy of semantic in linguistic analysis, the encyclopedic nature of linguistic meaning, the perspectival nature of linguistic meaning. The first characteristic merely states that the basic function of language involves meaning. The other two characteristics specify the nature of semantic phenomenon in question. Okay, here in this part, it wants to give us some information about the relationship between the cognitive linguistic and the semantic. The primacy of semantic in linguistic analysis follows in the straightforward fashion from the cognitive perspective itself. If the primary function of language is categorization, then meaning must be primary linguistic phenomenon. Okay, because one of the function of cognitive linguistic, as I told you, was categorization, and therefore for categorizing, the meaning is important and we should consider meaning. And because the categorization is the primary function of language and even the cognitive linguistic, then meaning must be primary linguistic phenomena. The encyclopedic nature of linguistic meaning follows from the categorical function of language. If language is a system for the categorization of the world, there is no need to postulate a systematic or structural level of linguistic meaning that is different from the level where world knowledge is associated with linguistic forms. Dear students, this is important. You should know these three characteristics of cognitive linguistic. The perspectival nature of linguistic meaning implies that the world is not objectively reflected in the language. The categorization function of the language imposes a structure on the world rather than just mirroring objective reality. These three fundamental characteristics of cognitive linguistics are important: primary of semantics in linguistic analysis, encyclopedic nature of linguistic meaning, and the perspectival nature of linguistic meaning. These three characteristics of cognitive linguistics is important and should know their details, which here we read about their details. Specifically, language is a way of organizing knowledge that reflects the needs, interests, and experiences of individuals and culture. The idea that linguistic meaning has a perspectivizing function is theoretically elaborated in the philosophical, epistemological position taken by cognitive linguistics. The experientalist position of cognitive linguistics vis-a-vis human knowledge emphasizes the view that human reason is determined by our organic embodiment and by our individual and collective experiences. Given this initial characterization of the cognitive nature of cognitive linguistics, we can now turn to the second question: how can it be that cognitive linguistics and generative grammar both proclaim themselves to be cognitive enterprises. Why they consider themselves as cognitive enterprises? Here we want to answer this question. We should know the answer of this question. That why generative grammar and cognitive linguistics consider themselves as cognitive enterprises. Essentially, the two approaches, means generative grammar and cognitive linguistics, differ with regard to the epistemological rule of natural language. They both agree that there can be no knowledge without the existence of a mental representation. Both of them believe that there can be no knowledge without the existence of a mental representation that has a constitutive, mediating role in the epistemological relationship between subject and object. But while according to cognitive linguistics, please pay attention to this point with capital sum, natural languages precisely embody such categorical perspective onto the outside world. The generative linguist takes natural language as the object of the epistemological relationship rather than as the intermediate link between subject and object. This is one of their differences. That cognitive linguistics consider natural languages precisely embody such as categorical perspective onto the outside world. The generative linguists take natural language as the object of the epistemological relationship rather than as the intermediate link between subject and object. Cognitive linguistics is interested in our knowledge of the world and studies the question how natural language contributes to it. This is the second difference. Cognitive linguistics is interested in our knowledge of the world and studies the question how natural language contributes to it. The generative linguist, conversely, is interested in our knowledge of the language and asks the question how such knowledge can be acquired given a cognitive theory of learning. This is the second difference between them. As cognitive enterprises, cognitive linguistics and generative grammar are similarly interested in those mental structures that are constitutive of knowledge. For the cognitive approach, natural language itself consists of such structures, and the relevant kind of knowledge is knowledge of the world. But for the generative grammarian, however, the knowledge under consideration is knowledge of the language, and the relevant mental structures are constituted by genetic endowment of human being that enable them to learn the language. Whereas generative grammar is interested in knowledge of the language, cognitive linguistics is, so to speak, interested in the knowledge through the language. These differences between the cognitive linguistic and generative grammar are important. You should know these differences. For a final exam, maybe I give one of these principle. For example, maybe I give this part that the knowledge under consideration is knowledge of the language, and the relevant mental structure are constituted by the genetic endowment of human being that enables them to learn the language. You should know that this is related to the generative grammarian. You should know these differences. Maybe I give the slot, the term, and give you the principle, and vice versa. The characterization that we just gave of the cognitive nature of cognitive linguistics in comparison with the cognitive nature of generative grammar suggests that There are two ways in which a direct confrontation of cognitive linguistic and generative grammar can be achieved. In the first place, taking into account the formalist stance of generative grammar, cognitive linguistics should try to show that an adequate description of the allegedly formal phenomena at the core of generative theory formation involves semantic and functional factors that are beyond the self-imposed limits of the generative framework. In this sense, cognitive linguistics is characterized by a specific working hypothesis about natural language, namely that much more in natural language can be explained on semantic and functional grounds than has hitherto been assumed. Anytime a particular phenomenon turns out to involve cognitive functioning rather than just formal syntax, the need to posit genetically given formal constraints on possible syntactic construction diminishes. In the second place, cognitive linguistics should develop a non-autonomous theory of language acquisition embodying the prediction first that language acquisition often involves mechanisms and constraints that are not specific to natural language, and second, to the extent that there do exist constraints on learning that are restricted to natural language acquisition, that this will at least to some extent draw on informational substance supplied by cognitive systems other than linguistic. Okay, to summarize, what hold together the diverse form of cognitive linguistics is the belief that linguistic knowledge involves not just knowledge of the language, but knowledge of the world as mediated by the language. To summarize, what holds together the diverse forms of cognitive linguistics is the belief that linguistic knowledge involves not just knowledge of the language, but knowledge of the world as mediated by language. This is important about cognitive linguistics. Because of this shift in the type of knowledge that the approaches focus on in contrast with generative grammar, and specifically because of the experientialist nature of cognitive linguistics, it is sometimes said that cognitive linguistics belongs to the second cognitive revolution, whereas generative grammar belongs to the first cognitive revolution. This summarization is important and should know that. They summarize all of the matter which we told you. What about the practical aspects of cognitive linguistics? We told you about the theoretical aspect of cognitive linguistics, but here about the practical aspect of this theory. Scientific frameworks are not just sets of concepts, models, and techniques. They also consist of people, activities, and channels of communication. Thinking in terms of people, the key figures of cognitive linguistics are George Lakoff, Ronald Lancaster, Leonard Talmy. Around this core of founding fathers who originated cognitive linguistics in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, two chronologically widening circles of cognitive linguistics may be discerned. A first wave coming to the fore in the second half of the 1980s consists of the early collaborators and the colleagues of the key figures, together with the first generation of students Names that come to the mind include those of Fauconnier, Swisser, Johnson, Turner, Gibbs, Croft, Goldberg, Tuggy, Janda, Kemer, Rice, Maldonado, Hogg. Simultaneously, a number of people in mostly Western and Central Europe took up the idea of cognitive linguistics and contributed to their international dissemination. Dear student, this is important, and again I refer to the important person of this series and the date of that series, which is important person are Lancaker, Lakoff and Ptolemy, and they were the founding father of cognitive linguistics, which comes in the late of 1970s and the early of 1980s. And here you can see other important person of this school. This person are another important person of cognitive linguistics, which I don't want to know all of this name, just the Lancaker, Ptolemy and Lakoff are the important one. The contacts between the people working in cognitive linguistics framework are facilitated by the ICLA or International Cognitive Linguistic Association. The association, which has a number of local and regional affiliates, organizes the biannual conferences in cognitive linguistics that constitute the rallying point for people working in the field. The first ICLC conference was organized in the 1989 in Duisburg by René Dirven, and later venues include Santa Cruz. Okay, they are not important, dear student. This paragraph is not important, just give us some information about the conferences of linguistics, cognitive linguistics. And here it gives us the information about the Journal of Cognitive Linguistics. I just read it, but I don't want to know all of them for the final exam. I just read it to be familiar with this journal. The journal Cognitive Linguistics, which was founded by Dirk Gerards in 1990, is the official journal of the ICLA. In the 2003, a second journal specifically devoted to research in cognitive linguistics, the annual review of cognitive linguistics, was launched under the auspices of the Spanish branch of ICLA. The book series dedicated to cognitive linguistics are published by two major publishing houses in linguistics. Martin de Gruyter of Berlin publishes the Cognitive Linguistics Research Series, and John Benjamin Publishing Company of Amsterdam publishes the Cognitive Linguistics in Practice Series. Okay, here it just gives us some information about the publication of this of the cognitive linguistics, which they are not important. Even the organization of the book is not important. The handbook, I don't want it. What about the appeal of cognitive linguistics? Dear student, the structure of the handbook is not important, and those paragraphs which I focus on there and I explain them, they are important. Cognitive linguistics is definitely a success in terms of academic appeal. The ICLC, that conferences, to give just one example, have grown into major events with more than 500 attendees. The openness and flexibility of theorizing in cognitive linguistics probably contributes to its attractiveness. As we have stressed, cognitive linguistics is a building with many rooms, and it may thus draw the attention of researchers with diverse interests. We think, however, that more is at stake. We would like to argue that cognitive linguistics combines a number of tendencies that may also be found in other contemporary developments in theoretical linguistics, and by combining them taps into the undercurrent of contemporary developments more than any other theoretical framework. More specifically, while the contextualization appears to be a fundamental underlying characteristics of the development of grammatical theory in 20th century linguistics, a number of current developments involve a recontextualization of grammar, and cognitive linguistics content embodies this recontextualization tendency more than any other approach. The logic behind the contextualization of 20th century grammar may be grasped if we take our starting point in Saussure. The Saussurian dichotomy between long and parallel create an internally divided grammar, a conception of language with, so to speak, a hole in the middle. On the one hand, long is defined as a social system, a set of collective conventions, a common code shared by a community. On the other hand, parallel is an individual psychological activity that consists of producing specific combination from the elements that are present in the code. You should know them. The definition of long, parallel, and when long and parallel are defined in this way, there is a gap between both. What is mediating factor that bridges the distance between the social and the psychological, between the community and the individual, between the system and the application of the system, between the code and the actual use of the code. The Chomskyan distinction, dear student, you should know the definition of long and parallel and the differences and their gap. The Chomskyan distinction between competence and performance formulate the fundamental answer to this question. The missing link between social code and the individual usage is the individual's knowledge of the code. Performance is basically equivalent with the parallel, but competence arises the notion of the linguistic system. Competence is the internal grammar of the language user, the knowledge that the language user has of the linguistic system and that he or she puts to use in actual performance. Remarkably, however, Chomsky introduces a new gap into the system rather than the trichotomy that one might expect. He restricts his conception of language to a new dichotomy. The social aspects of language are largely ignored. In comparison with a ternary distinction distinguishes between long competence and parallel performance, between social system, individual knowledge of the system, and individual use of the system. The binary distinction between competence and the performance create a new empty slot, leaving the social aspect of language largely out of sight. Dear students, you should know this matter, the gap, and the way which they use to overcome this gap. Relegating the social nature of language to the background correlates with a switch toward the phylogenetic universality of language. The Chomskyan emphasize on the genetic nature of natural language. They should know that the genetic nature of natural language links up logically with his apparent lack of interest for language as a social semiotic. Where in particular does the individual knowledge of the language come from? If the source of linguistic knowledge is not social, what else can it be than an innate and universal endowment? If the language is not learned through acculturation in the linguistic community, what other source could there be for linguistic knowledge except genetics? The link between the Chomskyan genetic perspective and the absence of any fundamental interest in language as a social phenomenon engenders a stepping stone development leading by an internal logic to an isolation of grammar. Let us go through the argument in the form of the following chain of proposition. First, if natural language is not primarily social, it has to be genetic. If natural language is not primarily social, it has to be genetic. This is the idea of Chomsky. This is the basic proposition that was described in the previous paragraph. The relationship could, of course, be constructed in the other direction as well. As presented above, the Chomskyan predilection for the genetic perspective in linguistic follows from his lack of interest for the social sides of language. But in actual historical fact, Chomsky's preference for a genetic conception of language seems to have grown more from his discussion with the behaviorist learning theory, in particular Skinner, than from a confrontation with Saussure, because the amazing ability of young children to acquire language cannot be explained on the basis of a stimulus response theory. So the argument goes, an innate knowledge of the language has to be assumed. But if one of the major features of language is its genetic nature, then of course the social aspects of language are epiphenomenal, regardless of the direction in which the link is constructed. However, the effects are clear. This is important, and it's explained about the natural, the language, which is one part of the natural language is genetic, and here we explain about this concept. You know that Chomsky was an person which believed that our language is like an software which is installed in the brain of all people. When they come to a special environment, by an stimulus in the environment, that knowledge will be acquired. Therefore, the genetic part and genetic aspect of language is very important for Chomsky. And about the extraordinary ability of children to learning and acquiring language, Chomsky explained that abilities through the genetic part of the language. I think it is enough until the second principle. This is enough. I want to explain it in the next session, but please just look at those paragraphs which I emphasize them, which I consider them as important matter, and you should summarize them and you should know them for a final exam. About the date, the important person, and the principle of cognitive linguistics. This paragraph was not important, and this is what not important. About the theoretical position of cognitive linguistics, just those matter which I focus on them, and I consider them as important. Just read them. For example, here it gives us some information about the principle of cognitive linguistics that is important, and this paragraph are not important. You can ignore them, but here this paragraph is important, which I explain it for you. Here we read about the differences and the similarity between generative grammar and cognitive linguistics. That is important. You should know the similarities and the differences between these two knowledge. And here again refer to the date and the important person of cognitive linguistics, and this information, which is about the journal, about the conferences of cognitive linguistics, they are not important. This title, the organization of the handbook, is not important at all. You can look over that, but this is important. You should know that. Here we again define the cognitive linguistics and its principle, and about the Chomsky view about the cognitive linguistics, and I explained them for you until the second principle. Please just look at the important matter, and all of the details are not important, and ask me your question about these matters. If they are not clear for you, ask me to make them clear for you. You know that your final exam is as multiple choice, therefore you should know the details, you should know the terms, the definition, but for your summarization, you just summarize the important point, and the details are not important. Thank you.